Welcome to the American Intelligence Media. My name is Douglas Gabriel, also known as Thomas Pain in the Ass of the Globalists, and especially a pain in the ass of the Privy Council. And I'm here today with my very good friend Michael McKibben, and we are going to discuss Dinner with the Oars. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Hi, Douglas.
I wish I could
come out of the mines and talk to you.
Oh, you down in Solomon's mines again, bringing up that gold and the diamonds. It's absolutely beautiful what you're doing. And your little piece that you picked out of the Judicial Watch 339 pages has us all excited. Not only what, you pointed out the word VeriSign in the Bruce Orr release of his behind closed door testimony, which does not agree with his wife, the beautiful Nellie Orr, but in the Nellie Orr beautiful documents got through a Freedom of Information Act request by the Judicial Watch, we have a description of Dinner with the Orrs, and not just a normal dinner with the Orrs, including Glenn Simpson and Christopher Steele, both of whom are really, basically, they're war actors working against America. Glenn, I guess, would be a treasonous person, and I guess, really, we'd have to say that Christopher Steele has been attacking America. He's about as big an enemy as we have at this point in an individual. Well, they were having dinner with them. That was one of the 60 times that Christopher Steele either met or talked with, and oftentimes met with in Washington, D.C., Bruce Orr, who became his back channel for basically the British Spygate attack on America. And we've gone into that a whole lot, but this is so juicy. I'm not going to say the words.
You got to remind everybody, Douglas, that Bruce Orr is just not any normal person. He's one of the top dogs in the senior executive service handing out compensation to Obama's stay-behind army.
You can't get much higher than him, okay? He literally sits on basically the SS, the council of the generals who rule our federal agencies. And they even rule everything but Donald Trump. Everyone below Donald Trump is subject to an SES person telling them what to do. And that's just the way it works. So the SES is the shadow government, and anyone who doesn't acknowledge that just needs to go to Wikipedia and read about it and do a tiny bit of study to find out that what we're telling you is true.
Well, at this stage, it appears that so many people are receiving compensation either directly or through pensions with the senior executive service that they have pretty much got the entire current and former federal employee system muzzled with all this dependence on SES for cash.
Oh, quite so. And even the controlled opposition, look closely, they're often SES members, and they go on for the rest of their life with all kinds of benefits that you can't even imagine. If you knew the benefits and the pay of senior executive service members decided by Bruce Orr, one of the top members of SES, who every year can give out a presidential award that the president knows nothing about, and give that SES member a $35,000 check for that year. They do this all the time. They do this with the 10,000 members of the SES. And the leaders of the SES are literally considered civilian generals. That's what they call them. But anyway, so Glenn Simpson, who used to work for Wall Street Journal, and it was beautiful that Nunes busted him and said that his dossier, which he passed through to Bruce Orr on his jump drive, different than Nellie Orr's jump drive, was really just the research he did on Paul Manafort in the Ukraine right at 2000. And so remember, Mary McCoby, I bet she was at one of these dinners with Glenn Simpson and Christopher Steele and the beautiful Nellie Orr and Bruce Orr, the treasonous Bruce Orr, SES head. And what were they discussing this time? Well, it was 4 days before they'd already put the physical wiretapping into Trump Towers, and later General Rogers told Trump about that, and he left Trump Towers. But that was for the Russian entrapment of the Trump team in Trump Towers to get dirt on Hillary. And they were going to record it, and it was going to be really the thing that would take down Trump. Well, 4 days before that, the Orrs were having one of their lovely dinners, and one of the most powerful people in Britain came over to have dinner with them. Can you tell us about your finding out of Judicial Watch's 339 pages and who it was that had dinner with Bruce and Nellie?
Yes, her name is Allison Sanders, Allison M. Saunders, Saunders. And at that time, she was the chief crown prosecutor for London, and had already been awarded the Order of the Bath in 2013. So she was a very senior person. But now, various researchers in England are pouring out information about her. Her 5 years as the chief crown prosecutor was mired in scandal, and we won't go into those. But the point is, the scandals were so bad when she was up for what should have been a customary perfunctory dameship in 2018, she was passed over. That's how bad it is with her. So here we have this chief crown prosecutor who, in our terminology, would be equivalent to an assistant attorney general. So in England, Alison Saunders reported to the attorney general for the United Kingdom. So her position would have been similar to Sally Yates's, who was Bruce Orr's boss. So here we have her coming over with an entourage and security to have this private dinner meeting at Bruce and Nellie Orr's home, which, according to Google Maps, was not that big of a building, a home. And that occurred 4 days before the infamous Trump Tower meeting. What's now coming out with all of the other information from the testimony of Lisa Page, who, by the way, used to work for Bruce Orr, that's usually not mentioned, but for 5 years she worked for Bruce Orr, and to hear her talk about it in her testimony, hardly knew the man that she worked for 5 years. But anyway, Bruce Orr's boss was Sally Yates, who was not at that meeting. That would have been the person to be an equivalent position to be at this meeting, but in fact it was just Bruce and Nellie Orr, and this was 4 days before the Trump Tower meeting. Now, it's obvious that the British had their hand, probably arms and feet, in this attempt to take down our president. That's what's apparent from this new information. And by the way, you mentioned Glenn Simpson being at this meeting, but I haven't seen any record of that. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but the records we've seen so far don't say he was there, that it was just Bruce and Nellie Orr.
Yes, and some other, her aide, as you pointed out,
staff.
Security and some staff, and then
Right.
it isn't quite clear exactly who all. But for sure, Bruce and Nellie and Allison were having a little tea, perhaps dinner, perhaps some crumpets, since she's so British. And they were discussing probably just the weather. I doubt that she came over with her security to discuss anything but the weather. And
Well, let me give you the other names, because they're in the Judicial Watch disclosure that was just published last week. Helen Kershaw, who appears to be her executive assistant, also Sue Patton and Patrick Stevens. In addition to that, she was arranging security for this home dinner as well. So this was quite a formal event occurring just 4 days. Did I mention it was just 4 days before the Trump Tower meeting?
well, I'd like to mention that 2 days later, Glenn Simpson, of course, Nellie Orr worked for Fusion GPS, so Glenn Simpson of Fusion GPS met with Natalia Veselnitskaya the day before and the day after the Trump Tower set up, the frame up, now let's go into that for a second. Why do you think that basically the Attorney General, the ex-Attorney General of Britain, came over to have this meeting? Well, here's why. Because Robert Hannigan, because he stepped down a few days after Trump was elected because of this crime that he committed I'm about to describe, Robert Hannigan, the head of their more or less NSA, the General Communications Headquarters, he came over months before upon invitation from John Brennan, the head of the CIA, they met at Fort Meade, Maryland, behind the back, unbeknownst to General Rogers, who was the head of the Admiral Rogers, who's the head of the NSA, and they set up a Five Eyes surveillance. This often happens, that we use our supposed friends to surveil our own countrymen in our own country. And so that's how we get around it. It wasn't us who surveilled Trump. Oh no, Trump, we never surveilled Trump. We didn't wiretap Trump in the Trump Towers. No, that was Britain that did it. Robert Hannigan did it personally. And so he set that up, and then the State Department helped Glenn Simpson to get Natalia Veselnitskaya, who was the set-up person with two other Russian spies that they had to give a special visa to from the State Department, a specially granted visa for Natalia and her friends, the Russian spies, the real Russian spies, some of the real Russian spies. And they got to set up this meeting, and it was wiretapped by Robert Hannigan, a Brit. This could not have happened without the Privy Council knowing it. Now, I want to make something perfectly clear. When I talk about the British, I'm not talking about the British people. I love the British people. I lived in England. I would choose to live in England if I wanted a pastoral, beautiful setting. It's a wonderful place. The people are beautiful. Never had a problem with a Brit, personally. But when we talk about the Privy Council, that's an extension. That is an evil extension of the monarchy. And the monarchy assumes that the Queen is higher than the rest of us and that she has certain privileges. You know, the Queen can simply dissolve Parliament. People forget that she has the right to say no on any legislation. People forget that she owns the Bank of England and that anyone in the Privy Council cannot be questioned because they're dealing with the Queen's business, and the Queen's business by law cannot be questioned. And so therefore, when you're talking about Alison Saunders, she is the chief Crown prosecutor for London. She's the Queen's girl. And there's no doubt in my mind that it had to do with Robert Hannigan's exposure of the entire British intelligence agencies by his stupidity of agreeing through Five Eyes to come over to spy on Trump during an election and give it to the opposing party. But also, remember, Fusion GPS is the one that was guiding Bruce Orr, Christopher Steele, Nellie Orr, and now invited Alison Saunders, either invited her or she came over to make sure to create the legal cover, in my opinion, for Robert Hannigan's illegal activity of spying on Trump, for the illegal activity.
And they could have been there to coach Orr on the meeting too, on how what's her name, the Russian attorney? Natalia
Veselnitskaya.
Yeah, coaching her on how to properly entrap these men.
Absolutely.
That were at that meeting.
Absolutely.
She was the chief criminal prosecutor for the UK. So she would have been very close to Michael Horowitz, by the way. Michael Horowitz, for a decade, consulted with all of our judiciary on sentencing guidelines. So this would be criminal sentencing.
Mm-hmm. Alison Saunders would have absolutely 100% known that Stephen Halper was one of the handlers for Christopher Steele. He is the one who told Christopher Steele, after meeting with Sir Richard Dearlove and other members of the Privy Council who I can name, and they created the British attack on us. And so Christopher Steele was he was the leading edge of that attack. He was actually the cardboard cutout. He isn't the one who wrote the dossier. He's an idiot, basically. He's a useful idiot who is being used by higher-up Brits. But Stephen Halper, who lives in England and is a Brit and an American, of course he was the one setting up the frame-up of George Papadopoulos with, Alexander Downer, Downer from Australia, Andrew Wood from Britain, Sir Christopher, all of them, this whole group, basically the Cambridge Intelligence Group, they set up and gave George Papadopoulos all these titles to make him out to be Trump's most important foreign advisor. And so when they entrapped him as wanting to get the Hillary 33,000 emails that were hacked by the Russians, which would then prove the Russians hacked the DNC to put to put Hillary down and to take Trump up, which is the craziest story. It's not even possible. It's not feasible. That's the reason they've never found any evidence on this. But the point is, Alison Saunders would have known that Stephen Halper and the rest of the British group were weaponizing Christopher Steele and using Bruce and Nellie Orr. She came over, as you say, to probably, now that you say this, she's one of the inner circle. She's got to be one of the top 5 people in this Spygate scandal, espionage, attempt to overthrow America. Because it's an attempt to overthrow America, folks. It's not just an attempt to overthrow Trump because they didn't like him. This overthrew our presidential election, and then it created a coup, and it created all these illegal activities that have cropped up out of it. And now there's 36 people who need to go to jail because of this. And Trump did not give out the unredacted FISA court supplemental information because it's going to reveal the British connection, you see. So she came over to make sure that, I believe, she was covering the basis for the Brits who were part of the Spygate and controlling the Americans who were the useful idiots, that would be both Orrs as well as others, and basically make sure that they were prepared for what was about to happen. Yes.
Oh, by the way, that was in 2016. In 2018, she left the British government and immediately went to work as a partner at Linklater's LLP. Let me read you this esteemed list of Linklater clients: Barclays, Wells Fargo, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, Air France, Societe Generale, Piper Jaffray, Dish Network, HSBC, Allied Irish, Altria Group, JP Morgan, Salix, Austrian and New Zealand Banking Group, Deutsche Börse, which is the German stock exchange, SAS, Martin Holland. It just goes on and on. Clearly, the list is essentially a list of the key fascist international companies that are in the process of trying to take over not only social networking, but also take over and form the New World Order.
And she learned that from Jeffrey Patty and Sir Lord Malloch, who have their...
I'm how could I have left off 2 others? Serco and the British Crown agents.
I love the last one. Now, I'm going to go off into the weeds for a moment, but not too far. On Robert Mueller's team, well, first off, Alison Saunders is now, she's freewheeling. So she no longer works just for the Privy Council. She's out there gathering her own greedy little share herself. And so that happens with these people. As a matter of fact, we pointed out that on the Mueller team, there is a very suspicious person. Her name is Arvinder Simbhai, Sembei, okay? She was the senior Crown prosecutor for England and Wales. Hello, bing, 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 bing. She would have had to have been bunk buddies with Alison Saunders. No other way around it. She had to have worked for her. Not only that, they would have almost had equally powerful equivalent positions. One's the chief and one's the senior. And I don't know how that works over there in Britain, but no doubt that when Arvinder Simbhai came to work for Robert Mueller, as the cover agent for 911, because remember, Robert Mueller is he's the number one person covering up 911. Until we put him in Gitmo as a treasonous murderer of 911, we haven't even begun. And then we can get the Clintons and the Bushes and all the rest of them. But he's the easiest. He's the low-hanging fruit. Because why he leaves trails, huge trails. I just want to point this out. That Arvinder Simbhai was she was in the London Centre for International Law Practice. Well, so was Joseph Mifsud, George Papadopoulos, Sir Richard Deere, all of them. They all belong to 2 groups, the Global Centre on Cooperative Security and the London Centre for International Law Practice, as corrupt as it gets. That's when the CIA goes rogue and finds out that they can become an intelligence agency like Christopher Steele did with Orbis International, where you really don't do anything, but you become a smear agent like Glenn Simpson, who used to work for the Wall Street Journal, and now just makes lies. That's all he does. He just lies. and he tries to convince people of propaganda and lies. Well, that's what these groups do. Joseph Mifsud was in this group. These groups were supported by Russians. These groups were also part of the Valdi Discussion Club, which meets with Putin once a year. I mean, we are talking about inside of the Robert Mueller investigation, Arvinder Simbai, who is almost the same as Allison Saunders, who now comes over, who is feeding the people creating the dossier. But please remember, Arvinder Simbai and her associate, who's also on the Robert Mueller team, Zainab Ahmad, along with Andrew Weissman, who's also on the Robert Mueller team, were the first two people to receive the first installments of Christopher Steele's dossier, called the Russian dossier. Okay? They were there from the beginning, telling Christopher what else to put in it and helping him write it. These people are on Robert Mueller's special counsel investigation. No one could be more compromised. And now we find out that Bruce Orr, the treasonous Bruce Orr, and the beautiful Nellie Orr, who's also now committed crimes, because what she's admitted, what we see in these documents shows that she committed crimes. She was trying to overthrow a sitting president. And then she went to work for VeriSign, and VeriSign is basically as corrupt as it can be. It's in the pocket of Hillary Clinton and worse, which Michael can go into.
Douglas, I just looked up Arvinder Simbai, it's a woman, is a director in something called Amicus Legal Consultants, and in her bio, she says she is a former practicing barrister for the senior Crown prosecutor. Boom.
These are the Queen's girls,
Allison,
handling the British Spygate. Now, when I say Queen's girls, okay, maybe the Queen is daft.
She's working with Mueller right now, right?
Arvinder Simbai, yes, and so is Zainab Ahmad, the first person to receive the fake installments from Christopher Steele and ask for more and give FBI information to Christopher Steele to add to it, give Sidney Blumenthal and Cody Shearer's versions, give Nellie Orr's version, give Glenn Simpson's version that Mary McCobie said he wrote, that now Devin Nunes says absolutely that what was on that jump drive that Glenn Simpson gave to Bruce Orr was more or less exactly what Mary McCobie said. Glenn Simpson's version of a Russian dossier trying to make Trump the bad guy, but using Manafort and what he knew about Manafort's involvement in the Ukraine with Viktor Yanukovych. So
let me read you a little bit more of her background. Legal advisor at the permanent joint headquarters of the Ministry of Defense. And her expertise, international cooperation, extradition law, international human rights, international humanitarian law, anti-corruption, and counterterrorism. You know, one of the things you notice after a while with these resumes of all these bad guys is they're all experts in anti-corruption and counterterrorism. What better way to learn how to do it?
And international crime. Bruce Orr used to be and now is again the head of the Division for International Crime. Michael Gaeta, the person who set up George Papadopoulos, international crime. These ladies, international crime. I mean, everybody, if you say international, then you say counterterrorism, which means you're a liar, a thief, an infiltrator, a saboteur, and nothing you say is true because your entire life is spent doing nothing but creating counterintelligence operations, which are nothing but lies. And that's what Crossfire Hurricane was. That's why all of these people, every one of them, including Zainab Ahmad, they're all terrorist experts. Counterterrorism, not terrorism. They're not going to stop terrorism. They're going to counter terrorism. In other words, they're going to create terrorism of their own to basically create the balance for the terrorism they're ignoring. And that's what Allison Saunders is. That's what Arvinder Simbai is. That's what Zainab Ahmad is. That's what Andrew Weissman is.
Well, just think about this, Douglas. You've got Arvinder Simbai actually working with Mueller officially. You've got Allison Saunders, who came over 4 days before the Trump Tower meeting to have a private dinner with Bruce and Nellie Orr at their home with full staff and security, which is really odd. If you're not, in fact, trying to cover your tracks and not be recorded. So it's evident that she was coaching them on exactly what to do to pull off all these schemes that these New World Order folks have been organizing for years, for decades.
Well, tell me this. Why is it that Arvinder Simbai, when she was the former British consul, the very title I gave you, the senior Crown prosecutor for England and Wales, why did she come over to work with Robert Mueller right after 9/11 on the 9/11 case? What did the British have to do with it? Why did they send one of their top attorneys in Britain to work with Robert Mueller, and now she works with him again to cover up for some of the very same crimes and the same people who committed similar crimes?
Wow.
So what we're seeing here, you have, in fact, because I didn't notice, to be quite frank with you, Alison Saunders' name. I don't know why I didn't notice that. Well, probably because it's 339 pages.
Yesterday.
Yeah, so you're really good, very careful researchers finding that name. That name would not have triggered me. But I'm sure glad that it triggered you when you did the research, because now what we see is...
It triggered somebody in England, by the way.
Aha, yeah. Some of your researchers, you have research all over the world. People don't understand that. I should mention that. All over the world. Some of the best I've ever seen. And people send us stuff all the time to say, is this real? Vet it, so on and so forth. So when we look at some of these things, we don't know what we're looking at first. And then we see the connections. Well, the connection here is when Robert Mueller had his special counsel, we have to remember that that's the same person who back in the times when Hillary Clinton at Rose Law Firm decided to start stealing all the patents, and especially any high-tech patents, Robert Mueller was right there with her. He's been protecting Hillary all along. He is the number one fixer. And in the interim, he goes out and makes, for Melanoptima, he gets, that was a, $15 million buy-in with a 38% return each year and return on investment. So
10 million buy-in.
10?
In a fund where the minimum is normally 1 million.
Yes, and so they gave him that for being a lawyer. Isn't that nice? He was a representative.
No,
for
I'm
a minute.
sorry. It was a $50,000 investment he made.
Yes.
Into that fund, which had a $10 million minimum.
And returns of huge amounts each year. One of the highest returns I've ever seen on any fund, and it's consistent.
Most of it's in the Cayman Islands.
Of course, they don't pay taxes on it. So, as I always say, anyone in these positions, senior executive service positions, they didn't demand more money when they got hired so that they would be an SES member unless they probably already had an offshore account. Okay, these are criminals. These are people who come into the government to make, sometimes 2, 3, 4, nobody knows how much SES members are paid, actually, but they make much more than civil servants. And that's from the get-go because they supposedly are more skilled. No, they're more skilled at criminality and more skilled at getting money. And then they get retirement funds, medical, everything for the rest of their lives. It's unbelievable. That's the reason.
Well, let me share with you a new thing that's coming out today out of the UK. We talked about VeriSign earlier. And VeriSign, soon after they went public, in late 1998. In 2000, they formed a British company by the name of VeriSign Inc. Limited. And that company was shut down, I believe, within the last 12 months, just recently. Well, looking through the documents, we see that a company became a director of VeriSign, and to cut a long story short, and it's typical of one of those rushed and nested dolls situations where one is related to another that's related to another. Bottom line is, one of the directors that worked with VeriSign for years was also a director in Al Jazeera International out of London.
Oh.
Now that's scary.
You mean
that our digital keys now are directly associated with Al Jazeera.
Osama bin Laden's channel, Al Gore's channel. Isn't that dandy? And,
wow.
They keep releasing these tapes, from Osama bin Laden on Al Jazeera, and no one ever goes to Al Jazeera and says, hey, where'd you get the tapes? That's because they were created by the rogue CIA, and they used at least 4 different doubles, demonstrated by the voice analysis and by the fact that he was already dying of his kidneys were dying when he was in Afghanistan. He didn't live long beyond that. The person they shot was certainly a double. Now I want to go back to nested dolls. Here's a nested doll situation for you. Robert Mueller, as he's investigating Russians, the one Russian in Britain who actually says that he knows Putin and meets with Putin because he's in the Valdi discussion club and meets with Putin every year in Sochi, which is true, is Joseph Mifsud. Well, Joseph Mifsud happens to be a Maltese professor, a Knight of Malta. Hello, he's connected to the Vatican. He teaches in Rome at the Link Campus University. And what does he teach? International intelligence. And so the rogue CIA, and actually one of the top ministers of Italy, and Stefan Rowe, a Russian, owns this university, and it's supposedly an extension of the University of Malta. It's nothing more than a rogue CIA hangout, an intelligence hangout, and that's where everybody goes to share information, okay? So Joseph Mifsud couldn't be any more principal in all of this. He is the one that was supposed to be the Russian connection, who's going to get George Papadopoulos a meeting with Putin. And then Carter Page was going to get hundreds of billions of dollars for setting up the money transfer from Alpha Bank to Trump Towers to a computer.
Wait. You mentioned Carter Page. Just yesterday, the documents were pulled out of the court case where he was actually cooperating with the FBI in a prosecution of Russian mobsters in 2015. So this idea that he would be attacked with 4 different FISA warrants for his alleged Russian connections is now proven to be a joke.
Well, he was supposed to be the Russian spy in the Trump campaign. He never met with Trump, never actually had an official meeting with him.
No, he was an FBI asset.
Correct. It's the opposite. An FBI asset working on a Russian case to put Yevgeny Bolkarev in jail, and his other 2 partners had to leave. And they got all kinds of information because they put listening devices in these folders that Carter Page gave them, which was his only thing he ever wrote about foreign affairs, basically, with oil and energy. And so these got all the way back to the Kremlin. So these folders were taken back by these other 2 GRU agents who were actually posing, working in New York, and the other one was, he was a diplomat from the United Nations. He got put in jail because what were they? They were spies, of course. Of course, they're always spies. Why would they not be anything but spies? Hello? Everyone we put over there in their country is a spy. I mean, look at Matt Gaeta in London. Matt Gaeta was the one who invited Christopher Steele to Rome, to the place where Joseph Mifsud taught, Link Campus University. And what did he do there? He hooked, believe this or not, George Papadopoulos up with Putin's niece, and they had an affair. And then Michael Gaeta is the person who was being, of course, controlled by Gina Haspel, because Michael Gaeta then met with Christopher Steele in London repeatedly.
Well, you bring Gina up because I haven't really spent any time looking at her, but when she became CIA director, and it became clear that she used to work in London while all this stuff was going on, the obvious conclusion is she knew what was going on. And now with this Carter Page revelation that he was actually an FBI asset, not a Russian agent, and they attack him 4 times with bogus FISA warrants, which Comey, Rosenstein, McCabe, and Sally Yates all signed off on. Those are the signatures we can see. There are others on there that we can't see, which probably is the Attorney General, but who knows? It's clear that the entire Mueller investigation is a total fraud.
Well, it's such a fraud that those FISA warrants, which I said from the beginning, and now it's come out because Nunes has revealed this, those FISA court 702 Title I domestic warrants were only applied for. There was no hearing. They were never granted. Now, the reason is...
by the way, the first version of those warrants was in June of 2016, so it had to be within the time frame of the the dinner with the Orrs, or maybe a few weeks afterward. It was turned down, but then it was reapplied for and finally issued in October of 2016. But it appears that that dinner with the Orrs was the triggering event for all sorts of attacks on our president, or our, at that time, candidate to be president.
I'm glad you bring out that incongruency. The June application shows that they already had the dossier. But supposedly, the Crossfire Hurricane CIA counterintelligence investigation didn't start until July 26, 2016. Hello? The FISA court warrant for Carter Page mentions the dossier, but the dossier, didn't even exist according to the CIA in July. That's how big of lies these are. They applied again in October as an insurance policy because they had been surveilling the whole time, and now it looked like Trump was going to be elected, and they needed an insurance policy for themselves. And that was to cover their trail, and also they needed to get Trump out, or they were all going to fry. They were all going to hang from the gallows. And that's what needs to have happen. So I'm glad you pointed out the incongruency there. Many times these subtleties are oftentimes forgotten, but when you go into them, all they do is verify what it is that we're saying. Now let's go back to the nested dolls. Okay, here we have the special counsel. So from the beginning, I said to you, well, how is it that these people, let's name them, let's this time do a thorough naming of them. Stephen Crocker from ICANN controls all the IP addresses. It was Robert Mueller, James Comey, Bill and Hillary Clinton, the guy from IBM who then became the head of the patent office. What's his name?
David J. Kapos.
Kapos, and then there's Chandler.
Kappos.
Yes, and then he basically controlled the patent office. Then there's the
evil. What list are you referring to right now?
The people who were there, well, really during the encryption conference, but also all the way back to Rose Law Firm.
Conference.
We're going all the way back to the QRS 11, in my opinion.
Okay, I've got a list of this is the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, for international peace, not just peace, international peace. The conference was on June 7th, 1993, discovered in a Judicial Watch FOIA request. Thank you, Tom Fenton.
Name them, because I'm naming them. Chandler. I want all their names out here right now.
Let me just do the ones that are highlighted for the moment, because it's a pretty long list. It's 2 pages of names, very tightly spaced. But we've got Martina Bradford, AT&T, Jim Bezos, RSA, then VeriSign, James Chandler, George Washington University, counsel at IBM, NSA, later Leader Technologies, David Chaum, DigiCash, Dan Cook, Department of State, Stephen Crocker, ICANN, and also TIS, Addison Fisher, Fisher International, then VeriSign, Saul Glassner, MITRE Corporation, the Jason Group, Tom Guidaboni, he was the John T. Brennan NSA cyber guy, Ann Harkins, Senate Judiciary Committee and Podesta Group, interesting, David Johnson, Wilmer Hale, Phil Karn, Qualcomm, Stuart Kern, Department of Treasury, worked with Larry Summers, Steve Lipner, MITRE Corporation, the Jason Group and Microsoft, Ken Mendelsohn, House Judiciary Committee and Stross Friedberg, Juan Osuna, the Department of Justice Immigration Oversight, John Podesta, White House, Kathy Russell, Senate Judiciary Committee, U.S. Ambassador for Women, John Sonderman, Department of State Export Control, Alan Shushinsky, Department of State Export Licensing, Lee Tien, redacted, and also Electronic Frontier Foundation, William Whitehurst, IBM, Stephen Wolf, NSA, Cisco, and Internet 2. And that's only about maybe 15% of the names on this list.
Well, Larry Summers, John Podesta, Robert Mueller, Comey. It's the same.
Well, let me read you some of the others on the list now that I've gone through it. Let's see. Stuart Baker, NSA. James Bamford, ABC, World News Tonight, and NSA. Jerry Berman, Electronic Frontier Foundation. Reese Brown, Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, House Judiciary Committee, John Cohen, House Telecom Committee, Colin Crow, Whitfield Diffie, Sun Microsystems, Woody Evans, U.S. West, Jen Laurie Goldman, ACLU, Harry Goodman, NPR, Evan Hendricks, the U.S. Privacy Council, Lance Hoffman, George Washington University, James K. Kallstrom, FBI, Ray Kamer, NIST, NIST, Stephen Levy, Macworld, Herb Lynn, National Academy of Sciences, Fred Mailman, Hewlett-Packard, John Markoff, New York Times, Alan McDonald, FBI, Kate McGee, Oracle.
I think that's
John
good.
Mintz,
The point
Washington
is,
Post.
it's really, really clear. You got
William Murray, Deloitte and Touche.
You got the media.
Bill Pauley, Apple Computer.
You got the billionaire corrupt. You got the people who were with Hillary stealing patents from the beginning. You got everybody there, but that's a little bit late of a group. The first early group is just that core group of about a dozen people who are all need a room at Gitmo. But the point is that they decided early on, and then that group you just read is the confirmation of it, that the media, that technology, that Silicon Valley, that the military, and that the politicians would all have a secret group that would control and weaponize technology. Now, I had asked you early on, going back to the QRS-11 and when they started stealing all these patents, I kept saying, well, where is the representative from the Privy Council? And then you pointed out that when Kapos went over to the patent office, Serco, a British-owned company, got control of the patent office, and every single patent is screened by Serco, which are controlled by basically the Privy Council. It's Britain's. So what we have here is we can do whatever we want here. We can play in our little sandbox here. But as far as the Privy Council is concerned, we are their subjects. And they get first choice on everything. And this is including military,
all of these
nuclear.
people gave it up to the Brits.
Yeah, so
amazing.
Let's just go back. Joseph Mifsud, who is a British spy, who's really a Maltese posing as professor, who's not a professor, who is in fact the following. Joseph Mifsud came over and was interviewed by Robert Mueller's special counsel. Wow, holy heavens, they're getting close to the true criminality. Oh, but that's right, that wasn't leaked into the press now, was it? No one knows that Joseph Mifsud testified, do they? Oh, why don't they know Joseph Mifsud testified? Because immediately afterwards, he came up missing. He's presumed dead. But who was he testifying to? Well, let's just remember that he is very, very close friends with Bill and Hillary. Let's remember that he is personally close friends with Robert Mueller. Let's remember that nobody's closer than him and Arvinda Simbai, the person we're just talking about. And Nainab Ahmad, both of them revere Joseph Mifsud. Oh, how about Dmitry Alperovich? Oh, very, very close friend of Joseph Mifsud, the guy who lied about the DNC being hacked. Who else does he know? And this is the one I really, really liked. Dear, dear friends with John Brennan. He testified. Nobody knows what he testified, and I'm sure that's not going to be in the report released to the public. But one thing's for sure, he probably pointed at Stephen Rowe, the guy who put up all the money for this, and he's a Russian. He also pointed at Oleg Deripaska, who was paying Christopher Steele, if there was any honesty. And remember, they might have been calling him in to ask his opinion because he has been their teacher and their mentor until now, after Hillary Clinton and the DNC put his name on a lawsuit demanding that he come forward and be indicted for hacking the DNC. They, months later, said that they did the research and found that he is presumed dead. Well, Stephen Rowe says he is not dead. He's just hiding. And Stephen Rowe wrote a book on this, and basically it's his alibi. So the London Academy of Diplomacy is where most of the Saudi Arabian intelligence is trained. And who is the head of that? Oh, that's Joseph Mifsud. So when you're talking about 911 and Saudi Arabia and Adnan Khashoggi, who is the biggest gun runner of all times and dear, dear friends with the Bushes. I mean, he and Daddy Bush are basically brothers. Well, guess what? It was Joseph Mifsud who trained all of them. So if you really want to get to the core of the question of the British attack upon our Constitution and our election and our sitting president and the George Soros color revolution that's going on to this very day, even though it's ending now because Adam Schiff says that he doesn't really think that there's going to be much come out of the Mueller investigation. And the only piece of evidence that anybody ever said they had was Adam Schiff lied and said he had physical evidence showing the collusion. Well, he now plays like that doesn't happen. And, of course, he's the head of the House Intelligence Committee. And then Nadler, he wants to say that he has a feeling that Trump colluded. And that's why he's going to call 80 people in for further investigation. Now they're backing off of that, and they're backing off of impeachment because they've been so embarrassed by the fact that they have all been compromised because of their Russian connections.
We have smoking gun evidence here. The dinner with the Orrs. Let me read you the Crown Agents Bank, which is clearly a part of this, where Linkletters has one of their directors. Just let me read you the experience and the associations of those directors real quick. Can I do that?
Please.
Douglas?
Oh, yes, please do.
Hello? Oh, okay. The Linkletters director is an expert in UK, Europe, and Far East, as well as Middle East and India. There you go. You got Chase Manhattan Bank, J.P. Morgan, HSBC, Deutsche Bank, Standard Chartered, Bourse Berlin. Notice that name came up again. Knight Capital, Crown Agents, Investments Management, Crown Agents Bank. And by the way, Crown Agents contracts many contracts with the U.S. government. Barclays, RBS, Morgan Stanley, Price Waterhouse, Credit Suisse, United Nations Migration Agency, Immunopharmacology, Citigroup, Deutsche Bank, Standard Chartered, Lloyd's of London, World Bank, Federal Reserve Board, interesting, the World Bank Group, Cambridge University, BlackRock, Central Banking, Intella, Celtel, HTN Towers, Interswitch, Helios, Exeter University, Price Waterhouse, and Bank of America. This list is getting pretty boring because it never changes.
It's always the same group at the top who own the assets, but you can't find out who really the shareholders are. When you can't find the shareholders, or if it has the word black in it, well, first off, that's CIA. And then if you can't find who the shareholders are, those are the same bankers who own the 12 central banks. And when you are looking very, very closely, you're going to find out it goes back to British families. Now, some of these families came from Germany, from Italy, from Switzerland, from Holland, but they ended up coming through the city of London. And the city of London is the most corrupt place in the world, but they learned from the Vatican. Now, Joseph Mifsud actually really did put people in contact with the real Russian who was directly talking to Putin. And that's the person they never mention. His name is Ivan Timovev. And he is absolutely the real deal, but he's not even in the dossier. So I could have done a better dossier than Christopher Steele and Cody Shearer and James Comey and Glenn Simpson and Nellie Orr. I could have written a much better one.
Well, you know, one of their problems when they're writing something like that about a culture they don't know anything about is you're sort of in the dark, and so it's easy to write things that just sound stupid because they don't deeply understand the culture. And it looks like Nellie somewhat understood it, and it sounds like she's read Russian but didn't speak it too well. They really needed to rely on real Russians to make sure they just didn't write stupid stuff. So I think that's why it took them so long to do it.
I mean,
and
Christopher
so
Steele,
consequently, it's not credible.
Christopher Steele sat behind a desk. He didn't know jack about Russia, okay? And he's an idiot. And every case that he's been involved in, he's showed himself to be very corrupt. As a matter of fact, Devin Nunes said just a couple days ago that if you look at the FIFA scandal, the World Soccer scandal, that it was supposedly Christopher Steele who took the guy down. No. It's the same people who went after that person because that's the biggest gambling going on in the world. I hope I didn't shock people just then, but when you talk about football, either in America or soccer, football, in the world, that's the biggest gambling going on. It's the most corrupt thing there is. And basically, the only reason he was able to penetrate them is because he's corrupt. And so he used the same exact sources. You'll actually see, just like Dmitry Alperovitch did with the artillery scandal in Ukraine, blaming it on Russia. Same thing. Dmitry blamed everything in the DNC on Russians using a 1.0 footprints of Russians that has been outdated for years. He did the same thing in Ukraine. Huge mistakes these idiots make. Same thing with Christopher Steele. His path of evidence is so huge, it's astounding. They got carried away in England. They started printing literally every week.
What they did. You know what they did, Douglas? The other thing I think they relied upon, and I don't think it's working out so good for them, they relied on propaganda. Propaganda's always worked for them, just to tell lies until people get tired and move on. But in this case, the alternative media is holding their feet to the fire, and they have not been able to be successful with this. The Russians did it, propaganda. And thankfully, we're in a little window here before they potentially completely take over the social space and kind of lock down their media control for the last 100 years. They haven't been so successful this time, and their lies aren't working.
Well, as you have pointed out, the last 100 years, the Brits have been trying to get the Americans to become their servants again, their vassals, their subjects. And so they've been propagandizing us, and they wanted the Anglo-American alliance to take over the world.
Well, they've been propagandizing themselves and the British people.
Oh, absolutely.
I lived over there, and I love the country, and I have so many friends I can't count. And I have a lot of respect for the average person that I worked with. But I didn't work much with the royals. I mean, I had some contact with certain lords in London, and actually spoke once at Canterbury Cathedral. Canterbury, it wasn't the cathedral, it was an auditorium next to it. Anyway, so this was obviously before I knew any of this New World Order stuff. But we've got a situation where once they learned that they could tell the British people any lie about the Germans in World War I, and the people believed it hook, line, and sinker, they knew they had a tiger by the tail, and have grabbed control and have it to this day.
Absolutely.
And that's 100 years ago. Let's make sure that 100 years is over.
And now they use the same propaganda to convince us that Angela Merkel, the Brits do, that Angela Merkel is a friend of the Brits. She's not. She's your enemy. She's going to create war against you. That's the reason her and Macron are setting up a European army, and they're not asking you to be part of it. They're not asking anybody to be part of it so that they can order it around. And then we find out what? Oh, they already created it behind everybody's back, just like she did the Nord Stream 1 oil pipeline deal with Russia. Here's the deal. The Brits need to make the Russians the enemy of all of Europe and America. If they don't, they're not successful at the clash of nations and keeping themselves in the dominant position. They're in the dominant position right now. They need our help, but they want to bring us in. The SES members, they're all read into this. They're all part of it. Hillary Clinton was not only read into it, she's trying to take over the place of the Queen. She's trying to be the American Queen, the American Privy Council. All this evil cabal we talk about that was with her down stealing patents, that's her Privy Council. So the Brits need the Russians to be the enemy, and the Atlantic Council is the propaganda. The British, well, it was to begin with very strongly British, propaganda machine for NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which basically is created to stop those Russians from getting into...
Can I point out something about Russia, because I happen to know a lot about it. The Russian culture is extremely old and has a wonderful heritage of spirituality that goes back at least 1,000 years and really longer. The communist era that we all know and has been hammered down our throats was just the last 100 years. but they have a very different experience of humanity and spirituality, and they have many holy people that live and work in that country. And it's getting more and more apparent that what's going on here is these New World Order secularists are attacking Russia because it has a Christian ethos, which is similar to the American ethos in that we believe certain things about the nature of God in Trinity, and that man is made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore all human beings on this planet are to be respected. That flies in the face of eugenics. And it appears now to me that World War I was just a good start for them. How many died in World War I? About 1 million or more?
Well, you can count World War I and World War II, and all the wars since is coming from the same source, and in none of them was Russia our enemy. Russia was our ally. And
right,
yes, Stalin was enemy to all people, Russians included.
Stalin was totally evil.
Absolutely, but the point
he
is,
appears to have been an agent of these people.
What we need to remember is that the Queen and the Privy Council work with Russia hand in glove. Hillary Clinton worked with Russia hand in glove. Hillary Clinton worked with the Brits hand in glove. So we, the American people, are left out of this triangular deal. Now China's trying to get in on it, and Trump is basically marginalizing them. And if he keeps up his trade deal, he's going to make them our vassal, which they should be. But the point is, if you don't have Russia as our enemy, and they're really not our enemy, there'd be no war. There'd be no need for nuclear weapons. China has the fewest nuclear weapons. They know you only need a couple. You only need a couple, folks. You don't need 50,000. And now we have each thousands on the side of Russia, thousands on our side. And
do you really believe any of those numbers anymore, Douglas?
No.
I'm beginning to think most of them were made up.
Well, I know that the uranium taken from the warheads of the Russians, which were brought into this country under the program called megatons for megawatts, was fake. And that was just an enrichment plan called the U.S., literally it was called the U.S. Enrichment Incorporated, which was basically a Bush family deal and a Clinton family deal. And they've continued it with the uranium-1. And that's the reason they don't think it's a big deal, because it's the same sellout of uranium to the Queen and to Vladimir Putin. But the point is, if Russia, through the Atlantic Council, isn't made into an enemy, then there's no reason for NATO. There's no reason for nuclear weapons. There's no reason for all this incredible expense that we put out. There's no need for it. And once Russia has been brought to its knees, and it was brought to its new throne by Hillary Clinton basically bringing, the Walmart idea to America. She sat on the Walton family paid position on the board in China, and that's the money that put lots of money into Arkansas, Chinese money. So the Chinese, through Hillary, have already infiltrated our country. We're having trouble getting them out of everything, the military, all of the technology, the whole thing. So what we're saying today is, thank you, Michael McKibben and your researchers, for going down into Solomon's mines and bringing up this wisdom to show us that once again, the Queen's Privy Council, through Alison Saunders, was here helping coordinate the attack through Fusion GPS in a meeting with the Orrs. And I just want to go to dinner with the Orrs.
And then it was carried on to this day by Arvinder Simbai.
Absolutely. Do you think you could get me a dinner with the Orrs? They must be very, very interesting to have such big people come and meet with them. But anyway, Michael, we want to thank you today. Keep up the good research. And I just don't know how you do it, but we want to thank you, because it seems as though every day you call us and you tell us things that amaze us. And it shows that
again,
really the dominoes are falling.
All the people around the world.
Dominoes are falling, Michael, and it's because of the good work that you and your researchers and Betsy and her team and Thomas Paine and the Conclave are doing, and all those people who are doing the same work that are putting the bright light of day on the mold and the scum that's growing in the Washington District of Crime.